This is Duke University.
So we pretty much got through descent, and the next step would have been recovery, which both of those movements, descent and recovery, the fall and then the getting up, connect directly to the construction of a pneumatology, or what theologians recognize as spirit talk, talk of the spirit, which then connects back to the slain in the spirit. So recovery then would suggest to us this moment of afterward, right? That yes, we are Black bodies, that is, are under attack. Black women are under attack intracommunally in the church, and sexual minorities in the Black church. Black people are under attack in greater society. And yet recovery, right? This movement, so we descend, we fall, we collapse in death, and yet we get back up, suggests there's another moment, right? And in the die-in, we read that descent and recovery as just that. We are being killed in the street, and yet there is something more. There is a recovery that happens and something that we need to press toward. So that would have been, in a nutshell, what I was pointing.
Is recovery collective? So is it a getting up together, or is it a...
Right. So yes. In the context of the die-in, it is, right? The bodies go down together and the bodies get up together, which points again to the pneumatology, to a problem I point out in the paper, which is, the question is, so what does it mean for white bodies to perform Black death in the die-in, right? Because we recognize this as a multicultural kind of moment, even though it's mobilized and the progenitors are approximately and for the most part young Black women. What does it mean for white bodies and non-Black bodies to participate in Black death through the die-in? The pneumatological moment is that it is precisely the spirit, right, that transgresses boundaries of difference, right? So yes, there is this collectivity that emerges in the die-in in a way that it doesn't emerge in the church, right? Where bodies are left to kind of get up as best they can and go on as best they can. And so ultimately my argument is that the die-in, or the spirit in the street spirit, has something to teach the church.
Just even right there where you stop, the street has something to teach the church, but I'm still lingering in what the church is teaching the street about this practice. Because, being slain in the spirit is an older kind of resistant practice as you're depicting it than street protests in, major northern cities in a certain kind of way. So when you just made that last shift, can you say some more about that?
My point really is to highlight a sort of new ecclesiology that's emerging from within a context of young, queer Black women who are precisely the people that the church invisibilizes, right, and demonizes, right? So it's not just kind of the heteronormative women, but it's the young queer women, right? So it's the youth, it's the sexuality, it's the gender, it's all of that. And then we could put color in, we could do a whole lot with that. But so I haven't done a lot about what the church is teaching the pneumatology that's happening in our streets, precisely because I think that what's happening in our streets is because of, without kind of the normative or the historical marker of leadership being the church, right? It's precisely because the church has taught so many variegated communities that they don't matter. So what we have and I could go on for days about that. And I am ordained and I am part of the church and all that. But so what we have is kind of this new church moment, right? Beyond the walls, without the iconography of cross and veil and all of that happening in the street. And the church, right, ought to learn something from this movement about I'm arguing about who the spirit is and how the spirit functions. Because the institution that has claimed the spirit, and I talk about this at the end, and really go deep into kind of a biblical discussion here, but within the New Testament, right, it is suggested that the church has been given the Spirit. And I make a distinction between given the Spirit and receiving the Spirit. Because in the New Testament, Christ also states that though the church has been given the Spirit goes where it will. And so I'm saying that the Spirit is actually in these aesthetic practices of resistance, like the dying. That is the Spirit manifesting. That is the Spirit moving. And the church needs to see it so they can get right. That's what I'm trying to say.
You know, there's a way that if you go through all kinds of modes of Black church physicality, from, you know, we could say ring shout, but be more particular inside what those movements are. I'm just like taking your argument and trying to think about how those moves, you know, wanted to be resistant modes of iteration or speaking. You know, the hailing, if we can maybe tie it to Augustus's presentation, so that the hailing is happening physically, whether the church wants the church or the past, you know, the kind of systems that you're setting up, whether they want them to or not. So this kind of possibility of Black women being, you know, animated subjects is physically enacted in this, you know. So I'm just kind of catching up with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just respond back to that?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So there's also a discussion in the chapter about Charles Long and his significations, and how he points us to an understanding of articulation beyond vocality, right? So again, this idea of, and I've written about this elsewhere, about an articulating body, that a body speaks even in silences, which has also been historically the case for Black bodies, certainly the case for Black women in churches, where, as I said in the paper, they are more often seen than heard. So to your point about movement historically in the Black church, beginning from the ring shout, I mean, we could even just take it back to the more extemporaneous ecstatic practices of the hush harbors, right? This idea that these are modalities of resistance that are claiming a sort of embodied vocality beyond words. So when the Black body is not heard, the movement is precisely, I mean, what this conference is about, right? The movement is precisely the resistance that has so much aesthetic weight. It should be paid more attention, which is what I'm doing in the context of Black theology.
But could you talk a little more about the, you know, and again, you raised the point that you don't want to diminish the practice by calling it performance in some weird way. Could you talk about the aesthetics of being slain in the spirit? Well, that's a funny word, but do you know what I'm trying to get at?
So the positive kind of benefits of,
not so much that, no, the actual, you know, an aesthetic is the word you might not want to put, but maybe the actual practice in its particularity. So you gave us kind of the language of fall and recovery, but could you be more particular about how it happens and it's recognizably received as being effective, complete, full? You see what I'm...
Yeah. It's always up for discussion, even in religious contexts where it's an acceptable ecstatic practice, right? There's always going to be spectators, similar to the die-in and other resistance mechanisms that are contemporarily relevant, where there will be spectators who say, that was not what it is. You know, that is not the spirit, or that is the spirit. So I guess, you know, as I said, it includes, it can be preceded by kind of rigorous praise, jumping, running, shouting, dancing, in very particular ways. But the height, I think, of the spiritual ecstasy comes in the moment of collapse, which is in a sort death. It is, I hate to get too deeply theological and was trying to stay away from it, Tommy, but it is, if we think to the story of the baptism of Jesus, and the story itself suggests descent and recovery in relationship to the Spirit. That when Jesus comes up, as in recovers from waters, the Spirit, the heavens open up and the Spirit descends. So this idea that we recognize baptism as a memorial of death. One dies when they are down, and as one comes up, they live again. So the collapse then in relationship to the moment of baptism, which is its own pneumatology in relationship to the Christological implications and eschatological implications therein, when we recognize that, we understand that moment of collapse, which is the apex of one's being slain, is the death. But what happens afterward? What happens after Trayvon and to Nicole? What happens after Eric Garner? What happens after Tamir Rice? What happens after Rakia and Ayanna and Renisha, right? Black masses get up. And what is the moment of recovery? How is the Spirit working in that moment? So
it strikes me that that's also, you said earlier, the verification of humanity, which parallels in the courtroom when she rose again and says, I am here, right? The presence of that as well as through the harvest. And so I see lots of parallels that go back to even the start of today in regards to the selfie being that kind of public presence, right? The calling of. And I'm also interested in adding in other spaces, which is the schools. Oftentimes you see the mobilization of youth in the public spaces, but not in schools. And to me, the schools act just like the courts, just like the church. Very, in many ways, gathering of bodies that do not allow these kinds of various articulations of humanity. In fact, they do completely the opposite, historically so. So in mobilizing those kinds of analytics, I'm curious as to why the schools continue to be left off the hook as spaces where current generations are needing to formulate.
What I think is interesting is that there was a recent, right around the time of the non-indictment of Eric Garner's killer, Daniel Pantaleo, there was students who wanted to protest by staging a die-in in the school. But they staged the die-in not in the classroom, but in the hallway, right? So what is it about the die-in, right, that defamiliarizes these sort of architectures of discipline, right, that kind of reveal in these spaces themselves the kind of what Harriet Jacobs might call the loopholes of retreat, right, the sort of the other pathways for the enactment of a kind of anti-discipline, right, so that the hallway in relationship to the classroom becomes the scene of of criminality, right, it becomes a scene of kind of a reckless movement. And in the case of the die-in, of a radical stillness, right? And Nicole and I were talking about this, the way that even stillness itself, right, the sort of an anti-activity, right, gets criminalized, specifically in terms of Ferguson. So I think that that's an interesting side. I mean, why is it that students? I think another thing that we see with particularly the criminalizations of Ferguson protesters has been a criminalization of mourning, so that schools have been a place where grief itself faces punishment, right? And so what is at stake there, right? Like, why is it that the classroom becomes a sort of becomes an injunctive towards a kind of uprightness, right? A kind of moving forward, not looking back, kind of an anti-grief timeline, right? And I'm wondering if, Augustus, you might want to speak about the way the courtroom functions in relationship to grief temporally.
Well, I mean, I think, so that's the reason why in the paper I talk about how the disrobing happens in the jury room.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen in the courtroom. Like I said, I mean, I think that there's something to be said about, like certain kind of ordinances around indecent exposure, which is probably why it wouldn't happen there. But I mean, even in the jury room, like it's done in complete silence. Um, which is to say that, I mean, maybe what it is that in these attempts to kind of make proper citizens, that people are finding alternate spaces within the system itself that suggests that like the spaces that you kind of are trying to discipline us in actually are not doing that kind of work. And maybe the kind of humanity that's being deployed is actually being deployed outside of that spatial category that is a jury room, a classroom, that kind of thing. And I think too, I mean, in line with certain kind of religious movements, I mean, that's one reason why people, I mean, for various reasons, but I mean, I think that's one reason why oftentimes when people were building churches, they say, or they said, I should say, the church is not big enough. We have to move outside the church. So you end up having tent meetings. You end up having these kind of, I would say like these quote unquote natural moments of worship outside where you're not kind of restricted by these walls where someone is kind of preaching at you and yelling at you for various reasons. So I mean, I think that there's something going on with like the subversion of spaces within systems and people really seeking to move outside of them to kind of exert a kind of natural or more legitimate humanity that the space itself does not, it's not affirm.
What your question raises for me is immediately I thought of the, what is it? This is not the right term, but the school to prison pipeline. And this idea that perhaps the reason why schools have not done well at this kind of work is because the school perhaps functions as the death rattle itself. Even as oftentimes, right? Even as, Black schools and white schools in terms of how schools condition certain kinds of bodies. So that the school itself is, in a sense, functioning when we think about how prisons are built right now, is functioning as the death rattle that precedes the actual death. So can the death rattle perform life? Not sure.
Just thinking, I hadn't thought about this until your question, is that the act of young people in school wanting to perform a die-in in solidarity with what's going on in the street actually calls attention to the school as a site of disciplinarity, especially the hallways where they're monitored, where they are suspended, where they are disciplined, that the hallway becomes just kind of an extension of what they're dealing with confronting the police state on the street, right? In ways that they are completely familiar with, but that are defamiliarized to us. And so it's a kind of looking outward on their part, but also forcing us to look at and remap and reconsider that space as well.
I was also just thinking of emotion. I mean, we don't teach students, part of the pedagogic, and I really appreciate the pedagogic question, but maybe the civilizing impulse, if you will, is to move emotion out of discourse.
Yeah.
So it's like rage or grief. I mean, even in college classrooms, we don't, or at least I don't, work with grief as a methodology to kind of help build knowledge. As an artist, we do that all the time. But there's this big difference between teaching art classes and teaching humanities-based kinds of disciplines or areas, and just kind of spinning in that. What would happen if we actually were to try to figure out how to use emotion as a resource? Of course, in Black arts, emotion is a huge resource. Emotion is sort of a driving impulse to create artistic product. So we have these school systems that are trying to deny the space of emotion in any kind of civil discourse. But then we have artistic practice that's built upon cycling through emotion and getting generatively able to keep cycling through emotion, to be a great blues singer or whatever, have to be able to have access to emotion. So they're kind of really working in opposite directions. And maybe that ties to spiritual practice as well. It's, emotion is a big part of maybe, or I don't know, if that's a way to think of it that's useful.
Emotion becomes the pivot in which knowledge is produced. So when you start going down historically to understand how schools have been constructed, and you have grad students that are realizing, oh my goodness, I've been miseducated, this was never intended for me, then there is that space of grief, and you can only work through it in order to get to them owning that knowledge production space. But that's not the mainstream pedagogical apparatus.
Does that only happen at grad schools? Because I thought you said schools, you were thinking children, younger.
Yeah, no, I mean, schooling, we're a school society.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you go back to Illich and deschooling society, you understand that society in general is an institution of schooling. But when I talk about school, I mean, yeah, from K through higher ed.
Oh, all the way,
I think
okay.
I think it all the way through.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.